welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. All right, the back half of my crazy month is about to begin. I am heading out to Madrid in a few hours for a big conference and expo. Then I get back for 2 days before going to New Orleans for a pal's wedding. After that, I get to rest a little. Just a day-long FDA meeting and a 2-day conference in Washington in early November. So not a lot of travel at that point, and things should be a little easier for me. Plus, I'm 3 weeks ahead on the show, so I'm not that concerned from the podcast end of things, although it can creep up on you in a hurry. For now, I think I'm good. I just wish my back would fix itself so I can get back to running. All the time I've spent in planes, trains, and automobiles, along with hotel beds, has done a number on me in the past week, and not being able to run is just driving me up the wall. But enough about me. This isn't Runner's World podcast, it's Virtual Memories Show. And this week on the show, we're going to conclude with the ad hoc Germany World War II triptych I did not know I was making. 2 weeks ago, we had Ken Crimstein on to talk about his new graphic bio of Hannah Arendt. And last week, Nora Krug talked about her new visual memoir about coming to terms with her family's history during the war. And that book's called Belonging, although outside the U.S. it goes by Heimat. This time around, I talk with Jason Lutes. Jason's the cartoonist behind the epic graphic novel Berlin from Drawn and Quarterly. Berlin began in the 1990s in serial format, 24-page issues, and it wound up taking 10 years longer to finish than Jason thought it would take. Berlin is about Berlin, particularly in the interwar period from 1928 to 1933. It starts with an artist moving to Berlin to study art and a journalist who's on the same train as her coming back after doing some reporting. And while it starts with their lives, it really grows to encompass a whole lot of different people and a lot of different trends and political waves in Berlin. It was ambitious as all heck when it began, and I was just the age where I was looking forward to seeing this coming out regularly and reaching its about 600-page goal. And even when the issues started to come out less frequently, Jason never seemed to drift from the goal of producing this monumental comic work. There are, I should note, other cartoonists, including past guests, who began major works and later abandoned them for a variety of reasons. Some of them commercial, sometimes they just lost the thread. But all that said, all credit to Jason Lutes for sticking with Berlin all these years. Now, this is a side note, but one of the really fascinating things to me about Berlin, besides the way that its depiction of Nazism on the rise in that era has some eerie parallels to our current one. But beyond that is the way it captures a certain era of comics making. Like I said, it began in the mid-90s, and that's really pre-internet, or at least a pre-social media world. And the comic in Jason's work sort of had to transition its way into the present. And similarly, the models of comics distribution from those 24-page issues that I mentioned to full-length books in bookstores is part of the meta-story behind this project. That said, you don't need to know any of that to enjoy Berlin. The complete work is an amazing, really good read. Jason does a phenomenal job of evoking the city, and we talk a bit about the research that went into finding what Berlin looked like in that era and imagining what was behind the walls of some of those buildings. Berlin's an amazing work, it's a fantastic accomplishment, and I'm awfully happy that Jason sat down with me to talk about it and the state of his career over these decades. Now, we recorded during CXC, Cartoon Crossroads Columbus, last weekend. Jason was there as a guest, and I was there as a leech. It was his first time going to CXC and getting to see the great Billy Ireland Library on the OSU campus. We recorded there in the office of past podcast Caitlin McGurk, an assistant professor and associate curator at the Billy. Because of timing, we got in about half of the episode Friday evening at the Billy before Caitlin invited/dragged us out of the office to go attend the opening awards presentation. Jason and I never reconnected that evening, although we did end up having dinner that night, which was a pretty phenomenal set. It was him, Tom Spurgeon, the organizer of CXC, two great Seattle cartoonists, Roberta Gregory and Jim Woodring, who's been on a few times, and the Argentine cartoonist Liniers, and me. And we got to riff, shoot the breeze, have a good evening at dinner. But anyway, Saturday we got back together at the public library that hosts most of CXC's weekend festivities. You'll know when the jump happens. I'll explain it all. As far as caveats go, not a whole lot outside of the split sessions. Now here's Jason's bio. Jason Lutes was born in New Jersey in 1967 and grew up reading American superhero and Western comics. In the late 1970s, he discovered Heavy Metal magazine and the tabletop role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons, both of which proved major influences on his creative development. Lutes graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design with a BFA in illustration, and in 1993 he began drawing a weekly comics page called Jar of Fools for Seattle's The Stranger. Lutes lives in Vermont with his partner and two children, where he teaches comics at the Center for Cartoon Studies. His new book is Berlin, from Drawn and Quarterly. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Jason Lutes. So my first question, what took you so long?
That's it.
And did you think of calling Gerhard at any time to do backgrounds or anything?
No, Gerhard and I aren't familiar, so I did not have that person to
fall back on
with.
Okay.
It took me. So when I started off, I thought, 600 pages. I'm 28 years old. At my current rate of production, I should be done by the time I'm 40. So that the original plan was pretty long. I imagined a finite ending. It wasn't just going to go on indefinitely. The story wasn't determined, but I knew that it was going to be limited, and I could imagine how long it would take me. And then, the royalty checks weren't big when they were coming out an issue at a time, and comic bookstores were not doing so great. And my book was, it had an audience, but it was a pretty limited audience, especially because it was just a subgroup of the people that are already going into comic book stores. And then I would get the royalty checks, 4 months after the book came out. So I'd have to do the work.
Yeah.
And then, and I never got sort of enough ahead of that game to have it be a regular flow of money, which was just enough for me to survive as a starving artist anyway. So at a certain point, I had to start taking on commercial illustration jobs.
Being a 28-year-old starving artist is different than being a 35, 36-year-old.
Yeah, right. It's different. The romance kind of fades after a while. You can only eat, ramen and live in a studio apartment for for so long. Although I loved that life, it was great. There was a very idyllic period where all I did in my spare time was like ride my bike around Seattle, explore strange parts of the city, come home and draw my comic, and that's all I had to worry about. And it was a really, really wonderful little period. But then, like, I fell in love and eventually had kids, and all those things just kind of.
I told you, this is my key to productivity. I no social life, no kids, I don't drink. So,
right. That's the way to do it.
Of course, all I do is make this bullshit podcast, but still, it's something. But how did the story actually change from your initial conception of what it was going to be to what it became over 550 pages? And do you feel like a loser for not hitting 600?
I definitely don't feel like a loser. I feel nothing but joy at having finished the book. And
I should say congratulations.
Thank you. It's my third baby. The story didn't really. So my whole approach in general to storytelling so far in my life has been, comics themselves are constraint driven because it's finite real estate. You've got pages. Print comics is what I'm talking about, not web comics. Each page is a narrative unit, and within that you've got your tiers and your panels, and there's already this kind of built-in structure that you can work with. And my approach was to. My first book, Jar of Fools, it was completely improvisational, page by page. I would write and draw a page and did not know what was going to happen until I drew the next page. Things would occur to me in my head, but I wouldn't know until I drew that page how the story was going to go. So in that book, I didn't know that the main character was a magician until I was some way into the story. I didn't know anything about any of the other characters because I hadn't developed them ahead of time. They all kind of just emerged from the story. So with Berlin, I took a more structured approach where I knew this was happening in a real place at a real point in history, and there were certain historical events which were going to affect the way the story evolved. And my job was to, I spent 2 years just doing research, and then I created these two sort of main characters. And the way I ended up thinking about it was I just kind of like nudged them onto the stage of the city of Berlin and watched them go. And so I would follow them from situation to situation and put myself in their shoes and think about what decisions they would make. And those decisions would lead one way or another. And new characters would walk in on a panel, and I'd say to myself, oh, who's that person? They seem interesting to me, and I might follow that person. And then those characters grew to be these very apparently minor characters grew to be big, important parts of the story.
Yeah, were there ones that surprised you in that respect?
The biggest ones that became really important were Gudrun Brown, who's this working class mother who sort of joins the Communist Party, and her daughter Sylvia. And when Gudrun sort of walks on, she's carrying an umbrella in a rainstorm, and I just think my initial thought was I'm just going to have this person walk across a couple of pages, and you're going to hear her internal monologue, and it's going to give you some insight into her life as a textile worker, and then she's going to walk off. It's just going to be this kind of. There's a lot of drifting perspective in the story where you're getting people's internal monologues a lot. So she was just going to be another one of those characters. And then as I got to a certain point, I was like, oh, I want to know more about this person. So I followed her home and met her family and got to know her daughter. And then Gudrun has her sort of fate that she meets. And the story in the latter parts of the book, her daughter Sylvia becomes a really kind of important part of the story. And that all just came out of me sort of being in there exploring. So in the very beginning, there was the structure was only the page count that I was shooting for and these historical events that I knew were going to happen. And then beyond that, it was just improvisation to get to those points. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen between now and the elections of 1930? Like, I'm going to follow my characters until we get there and see what happens.
Yeah. And you talked about the publishing model becoming a disaster for you in the process of making the comic.
Yeah.
Did you foresee the trade paperback era and the collections world? And is it one of those things where you wish you'd started the project later when a bookstore market existed, or at least an Amazon?
Yeah, no, I have no regrets about when I started it. My friends and I at the time, our little circle of cartoonists, we were all about wanting to get comics into bookstores and wanting comics to have spines and wanting to put them on the shelves and wanting to shelve them by category in the bookstore, not on a graphic novel shelf.
Yeah, all the comics. Yeah,
right? if you go, ideally my book would be filed in history or fiction, right? Like that's generally where I would hope it would be found. And that was true in the early 90s amongst me and my friends. Like we saw that as kind of the way forward was to get out of the comic book stores, because they were very, very limiting in lots of ways, right? It's mainly young white men who are going into those comic book stores. A lot of those stores were not in any way inviting or friendly to the average consumer of non-superhero fan. Yeah. And all those fans are great, and that market is great, but like there's other kinds of comics that we wanted to make, and that those shops, and I'm speaking very generally, there were certainly exceptions to that, a lot of really wonderful shops that did a really great job of curating the stuff they put on the shelves. And bringing in new customers, but I guess what I should say is we wanted that market, but we also wanted to spread out into this.
To be able to reach we wouldn't say mainstream, but at least a literary audience.
Yeah, to reach more literary audience. Yeah, because we thought, and by we I mean it was the people in my little circle were James Sturm, Ed Brubaker, Tom Hart, John Lewis, Jennifer Daydreamer, Ellen Forney, David Lasky.
The young Seattle Mafia.
The young Seattle crowd. And
crowd's better than Mafia, I suppose. But yeah.
It was definitely not a Mafia. We had no power. Yeah. We had zero power. It was really, and that was around the time that very shortly after that, the graphic novel term got, Will Eisner kind of coined it, but it got...
Yeah, but do you like that term?
It's fine. It's a marketing tool. When it first happened, when it first came on, I didn't like it because I felt like, no, it's just comics. It's just comics. Comics is a medium.
But as marketing goes, you have to
do it. And the bookstores that got together to do it, it was really smart of them to do that, and it worked. We're now seeing that it clearly worked. I hear that word much more often from just like parents at my kids' school who never read comics growing up. They know what a graphic novel is.
And they wouldn't say they read. No, I don't read comics. I read graphic novels.
No, actually, they actually ask me. They're like, "What do you call them? Is your book a graphic novel?" And I'm like, sure, but I call it comics. Comics is the medium. I call my book a comic. I don't have any. I'm not proprietary about those, or like I'm not like picky about those terms. It's all good, but yeah.
Also, when it comes to the publishing model, though, you did stick with the 24-page pamphlet longer than anyone else did. in our world.
It may have been one of the few. I think when issue 22 came out, it was one of the few pamphlets.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, that wasn't a superhero thing. Like almost everyone had moved away from in the, we'll call it arts comics world, however we want to define it. But yeah, was that what
that was part of the challenge for me, and part of the reason I fell off the kind of the regular production things. I couldn't keep up. The two things about that physical form were that the comic pamphlet itself, comic book stores were set up to sell that. They had shelves that could handle it. They had racks that could handle it. They were used to handling these pamphlet books, so that was this kind of established format that you could produce stuff in, and so that's one of the reasons I chose that. I wanted to do a much longer story episodically, and chapter by chapter made sense. A lot of other people were doing it, like Dave Sim, etc.
You'll find the ones who did that tended to go insane.
Yeah, right. The ones who really have to churn it out. And I think that's the thing that got to me, was like, along with that, those stores expected a regular production, a regular rate, just like they were getting from the mainstream houses, which had whole teams of people working on their books. But when you're doing it by yourself, and you do have a little bit of a life outside of that, it's very demanding, and also working that much wasn't fun to me. Yeah. I wanted to enjoy other parts of life. I didn't want to just be sitting at my drawing table all the time. I was in my 20s, and I had, there was a whole world to explore, an actual physical, real world, and I wanted to get out there into it.
Now that you're going to be 50, that's really limited, and you're fine just being in a little cocoon, right? That's.
I work a lot in my basement, but right out my back door is some woods and a river, so I get out as much as I can. Not as much as I should, but as much as I can. So that format was both. It came in at a really weird time where, I had to produce to that format, and it was useful. Like, it was great to have chapters actually published. My work could get out there, and I could develop a little bit of an audience by having it be visible. Chris Oliveros at Drawn and Quarterly never hassled me about deadlines. For better or for worse.
I was going to say,
a lot of fans
you're still working for us?
That, but I was very, but it had this funny effect of like when he didn't do that, it was like, oh my God, like he's being so generous and relaxed about this, and he really believes that the art takes the time that it needs to take. You can't rush it. And that had such a profound effect on me. I just really appreciated that. And in the end, like, that made me work harder on the book because I wanted to, like, meet Chris's, to meet that kind of goal that he had set, or that, what's the word? That philosophy is something I wanted to satisfy. So that was the format stuff was very, very weird. And I maintained it with 22 issues over roughly the same amount of years. And, it did feel like at the end that I was just that last little pamphlet dropped on the doorstep of the comic shop.
Yeah. Now, seeing it as a big collected hardcover, I'm going to ask you about your reaction to it when you finally saw it all in one place. But first, were you tempted to redraw things? Because Eddie Campbell talks about that, and the episode will be airing soon, like with the From Hell colorization he's doing now. Right. He's redrawing panels also.
Whoa.
Yeah, okay, so from that reaction, I'm sure you're convinced that it would have been a...
I did redraw some stuff. Like the book also, in addition to these 22 chapters, it came out in 8 and 6 chapter installment, like volumes. So there were these... before the big collection at the end, there were this
the
trilogy.
2 books initially, yeah.
And after the end of the first one, I did go back and look at everything. Or when the first one was going to come out, I went back and I kind of looked this up. And I redrew the first several pages because the drawing, to me, looked so awkward and bad that I need to redraw it. And now, of course, those same pages look awkward and bad to me. Yeah. But because that's just like an endlessly... Yeah. You'll end up swallowing your own tail.
And that's what I wondered. If you... Well, just this one panel, and then it turns into, if I just redraw issue 18, that'll really make it all...
It's really dangerous, and I discourage my students from doing that when they notice mistakes. It's just like, don't let the perfect be enemy of the functional. Just like...
Well, it's like seeing the early Cerebus. Yeah, I mean, they look terrible in comparison. We'll just be honest.
And what's wrong with that?
Like, that's what I'm saying. It's fine.
Like the artist you're in your work all the time, and this kind of urge towards like illusory perfection is like... It's just not true. I love looking at early Hergé or early Charles Schultz. In fact, I prefer early Schultz because of the way he draws, because he hasn't quite gotten polished and he's still figuring it out. And early Hergé is great because it's just clumsy and awkward and blocky. But when I encountered Hergé when I was 10 years old, it was like this beautiful, pristine color albums which he had already redrawn. He redrew those albums several times. So it was amazing to discover, he's just a human being who got better.
That was, to me, was one of the great... It was not comics, but it was either Beatles or Elvis Costello demos, and realizing, it wasn't perfect. There were variations. They had to work on it. Yeah. Gil, you should also not have to expect your shit to be perfect, but I've never gotten over that part of it.
That's one of the reasons I love reading like real biographies of creative people. Is just like seeing the nuts and bolts of their life, and how much of their personal life ended up affecting their creative work and all that. I just love seeing the whole picture because it's all every piece of art is an autobiography to one degree or another. And when you try to somehow create this image that you want the world to think of you as, to perceive you as, which is a huge part of entertainment in some areas, when you're trying to create this persona or this presentation that is not that is like a screen or a polished surface, I guess that says something too on its own. But I'm more interested in the kind of warts and all.
Yeah, seeing what's behind the curtain. Was there a challenge in terms of keeping the style over the course of 22 years?
I didn't. I've heard that question a couple times, and
fine.
No. I'm sorry.
I'm kidding.
I literally mean 2 times.
No, but it is. It's an interesting question to me. Like, Seth changed.
Yeah.
Clyde Fans is not the style he draws in it. He has to force himself to draw the Clyde Fans style because he's evolved and moved on.
Yeah, sure.
But he has to stay in that style to finish that serial. And so I wonder, did you have
really
that sort of temptation?
I think my approach to art is like I try to draw in a way that serves the content, and as opposed to, I don't feel like I evolve as like a personal, like a stylist. I don't evolve as a master of tools the way somebody like Seth might. Like I feel like I try to create art that's completely in service of whatever story I'm telling, and I approached Berlin as a sort of semi-documentary. Like I imagined it being kind of filmed in black and white, and I just wanted the art to be kind of as relatively objective as possible. So there's a kind of reserved, kind of cool quality to it, and I think that was relatively easy to maintain because it wasn't like it was a style. It was like I was just trying to render objects, render streets, pretty straightforwardly. And now when I'm moving past that to my next thing, I'm thinking more consciously about, well, what kind of approach do I want to have visually, and how's it going to be different, and what am I going to do? How's it going to look different? And why? And are the reasons good? What would be an appropriate style for this next thing?
You didn't have a temptation to just draw an issue like Al Columbia instead of your standard size. You really just
Yeah, no, I never had. It was always I do these all the pages were thumbnailed out as these little inch high thumbnail drawings, and they were just great. It was great to trick myself into drawing things I would never choose to draw. Like when you draw a crowd scene and it's only an eighth of an inch high, it's just a couple of little quick pencil marks on a page.
Unless you're Sergio.
Yes, right. And then I would make these little kind of what's the word, approachable little diagrams. They were not intimidating, but then I would have to, after I wrote a 24-page chapter, I'd have to look at those diagrams and turn them into finished pages, and I'd be like, oh shit, now I have to draw this crowd scene. But I had sort of made this commitment in the thumbnails that I had to follow through on, so it was a way of, that's why there's a lot of really complicated street scenes and architecture and crowds of people, because those things were put in there in service of the story, and then afterwards it's like, well, now I have to do the work of drawing those things.
It's a question that actually came up. Nora Krug brought it up last week on the show. Do you keep a sketchbook?
I do not. I'm not
Same
one of those
thing.
people. Really?
Yeah, she doesn't keep a sketchbook because for her, art is the visual
thing,
is to serve whatever story she's creating, and it's not there to just screw around and draw stuff. She only draws when it's for a page.
Yeah, when she needs it for purposeful.
Yeah, that's
I there are two kinds of cartoonists in the world, and there is a large, probably a majority of cartoonists that I know do keep some kind of sketchbook because they're compulsive drawers. They love to draw. It's in their blood. It just comes out of them. They'll just sit down and start doodling on a napkin or whatever. And I've never been that kind of person. I did try to keep a sketchbook like in high school, and it was just it felt like an effort. I had to remind myself to do it, and so I just stopped doing it. Whenever I draw, it's usually towards an end. I'll do lots of studies of things because I'm trying to understand them better in order to draw them in my comic.
But those are for the purpose.
Right, they're directed towards whatever story.
Yeah, so just like I talked about with Nora, then it's a very Germanic approach to this. So the art is utilitarian tool in service of telling the story.
Yeah,
so.
I think that's totally fair. And it turns out I do have some German heritage that I didn't know I had before I started this book. So that's probably part of it.
I was also happy as I was researching where Berlin came from to find that it was basically the idea came from an ad in The Nation, because I just figured potentially it would have been from listening to Achtung Baby around that era, like 92, 93, that you would have had the Berlin, man, that's I should go find out about this. So good.
That's Wings of Desire was one of the things that went into the hopper, and then weirdly, I was around the time I started the book, I think I'd put out the first issue. I learned that my brother, who I'm not super close with, we're not estranged or anything, but I don't see very much of him. Around the same time, he started up a band called Dresden. So we each independently
just came up with
these creative endeavors that had the names of German cities.
In other interviews, you talked about comic influences and literary ones, but can you talk a little about the cinematic besides Wim Wenders? Berlin is very visual, and it's very paced in a way that there are cinematic aspects to it. I know it's comics in that McCloudian sense, but how much did your cinematic background or your consumption habits play into?
I think
Berlin?
probably a lot. I mean, it's pretty clear looking at it. There's big sweeping panoramas. There's lots of pullback shots and. But I couldn't point to really. I mean, in Wings of Desire, it's not even necessarily the way it was filmed. It was more like the content and the fact that it took place in Berlin, and it had this kind of atmosphere about it, which I found very affecting. And then in that story, it's about these angels that can listen in on the thoughts of passersby, which becomes a part of my story as well. So that kind of affected a kind of approach to the storytelling and the feeling. But in terms of visual dynamics and stuff, I think I just absorbed so much film that a lot of the basic vocabulary was just in there ready to find its way out. But I do remember being really affected by late 80s, early 90s indie film. I was watching
just say Jim Jarmusch, and we were all watching this.
Right, Jim Jarmusch. And there's got to be some other people too, but he comes up.
Yeah, Cronenberg, Coen Brothers. We've got
Coen Brothers,
early
right?
days.
Never really watched that much Cronenberg because it was too creepy for me. I was just like
the Naked Lunch adaptations.
Oh no, I know I saw it.
Yeah,
I did eventually saw Naked Lunch, and I really appreciate Cronenberg, but it didn't really grab me.
Yeah.
And who's the other?
Lynch, of course.
Yes, and Lynch was huge. Like when Twin Peaks aired on television, and I was one of those people that gathered around each week to watch the next episode. That was revelatory in a lot of different ways. It showed that television itself was like abiding by this creaky formula and had been doing so for years. And here comes somebody who's just like, nope, not going to do that. And it was totally inspiring to learn that somebody could just flout convention like that so like easily. And I mean, what an incredibly privileged life he's managed to lead to get himself into that position where he can basically do whatever random thing he feels like doing. He's been able to do. He doesn't always get financing, but he's always stayed true to this kind of internal vision and also the kind of the dream life, which I think plays a really big part in his work. And I think I really took that to heart when I was reading and learning about him. Blue Velvet was big too. The first time I saw Blue Velvet, that was like really, really big. I really was. I sort of adapted, or at least I tuned into this way that he was drawing on his unconscious.
Yeah.
He was drawing on imagery that just came up out of him, and he didn't question the imagery. He just would like work with it. And that, I think, definitely had a big effect on how I would approach storytelling in general.
And it's very challenging because it can too easily degenerate into into bullshit, basically. It can be like, let me tell you about my dream.
Yes.
He manages to avoid that because I think, as you put it, the images are so authentic. We don't know what this means, but this clearly came out of a dude's
and then
head.
he does this thing where it's right, the whole let me tell you about this dream thing. And my friend Abby has this joke where she says, we used to be roommates, and we'd get up in the morning and have breakfast, and she'd say, like, let me tell you guys about my dream. I had this amazing dream last night, and you were all in it. And she would just lie about that part because she just wanted you to listen to the
feel
dream.
like you were part of this.
Because nobody wants to listen to somebody else's dream.
It's the most boring thing in the world.
There's nothing grounding about it. It's just like, it makes a lot of sense in their head, but not in yours. And what Lynch was able to do was like ground that stuff. Like this the new
I've heard it's amazing, but I haven't watched it.
It's a lot to sit through, and you got, it has a lot of those Lynchian, incredibly long, inexplicable, boring parts, but like the payoff is like staggering. It's like incredible. And he's just somehow able to, and you do have to, there are periods where he loses his audience because they're not ready to follow him down these kind of rambling roads, but like, but he's uncompromising, and I think that's really, really amazing. And he's really lucky to be able to do that to the degree that he has been. Yeah,
but you'll get there. You'll see. I'm just. What did Berlin teach you about comics besides don't publish in 24 page format?
Well, I wouldn't do it any differently.
I know,
because it allowed me. If I had to work on a 600-page book for 22 years and never have it, not have it see print till the end, that I don't know if I could have done. Like, this was actually turned out to be a really great way for me to get this thing done because I had. The assurance that a chapter would get published, and
that's how they built the Erie Canal.
That's right.
They had to keep. They built it in segments that they would, then start moving boats on it, so they could get money to build the next segment.
Yeah, there you go. That's perfect. Yeah,
so I guess that sort of holds up. But
I learned. Well, Jar of Fools, my first book, was very much my self-education in comics. I went to art school, but they didn't teach comics there. I got a comics class started at the Rhode Island School of Design, and I took it several times over, the same class, because I wanted to make comics. And I learned a little bit, but really it was embarking on this book where I had to draw a page a week, which was appearing in the Seattle Stranger, and tell this longer story. And that was really my self-education. That was me figuring out how comics worked. And I think also folding in the kind of narrative visual stuff I was picking up from film and stuff from books as well. And kind of figuring out who I was as a cartoonist. There's like a little bit of Ben Catcher in there. There's some Chester Brown in there. And I was kind of synthesizing all that and learning the medium. And then by the end of that book, I was like, okay, I think I have a really good sense now of how this medium works for me. And I could tell any kind of story I want to. Like, wow, I get it. Like this, I know how to use comics now. So I could have chosen any subject, I think. And that one just bubbled up out of my unconscious. And then in the course of writing it, I learned, there's a lot of things I learned.
Yeah.
I learned a lot about people. I learned about, it was a self-education not only in the medium more. It was like an advanced class in the medium, but it was also an education about Berlin and this period of history, which was, in the end, one of the reasons I did it was so that I could understand the circumstances that led to the rise of fascism and World War II and the Holocaust. That was on a level I did not understand until I was almost halfway through. That's what I was doing, was processing that part of human history so that I could understand how this unthinkable thing could happen. So more than an education in how comics works, I feel like it was an education in human nature and
the 20th century
and the 20th century and the double-edged sword of technology and like all of that stuff. And it felt very, very. It was not a story that felt at arm's length to me. There were many resonances with my real life stuff happening around me. And it's all the more strange that at the point at which this book is seeing publication, it coincides with a rise in nationalism in our own country.
Yeah. I will ask you about the challenge of not foreshadowing in the book. But the fact that you brought up Chester and Ben makes me, well... It raises the question for me. Chester's Catholicism permeates all of his work. Uh-huh. Ben's Judaism, although non-practicing, his comics are schlocky Jewish comics, ultimately, if you're a schlocky Jew like me. Yeah. Your religion and or ethnicity? Or do you consider yourself basically just a boring white guy?
Northern European, totally boring white guy.
Do you see
religion,
that informing?
Zero religion. I think what comes out
how
of
do you
that,
see it?
I think of all the things I've been exposed to spiritually, I really appreciate a lot of things about Buddhism, and all my friends who are Jewish, I've gotten familiar with Jewish tradition and really come to appreciate a lot about that. And Jewish culture and folklore and tradition is something that I feel great kinship for. And feels very comfortable to me, but it's not. It's something.
But you don't feel any sense of that, coming out in your work at all. And that's what I wondered, because both of those artists. This would be a weird comparison, but it was like when Britney Spears was becoming big, and everybody said she was the next Madonna. Camille Paglia jumped down everyone's throat on that one. So Madonna was processing Catholicism and sexuality in all her work. Britney Spears is a Midwestern Protestant girl who has nothing going on back there. Yeah. So I'm interested in that respect because your comics, to me, don't evince that sense of the religiosity or something in the background, some sort of ethnic
And I think that's a kind of, to some degree, I wish that I had more of that.
It might be the first time you've been compared to Britney Spears.
I appreciate that.
The crop top is pretty sexy. I got to say, Jason, you're rocking that pretty well. But yeah, so there's just a sense of synthesis, I guess, of those artists in terms of
and I think that the lack of religiosity in my book and in my life, I think, is kind of a weakness in terms of when I try to represent that, because I don't have an intimate familiarity with that stuff. Mm-hmm. So when I try to show my Jewish characters in synagogue, or I try to show my working class mother in a Salvation Army shelter where they're singing hymns, I kind of, it's a little bit like I'm hoping that works because I don't really know. And I think, if anything, I do have a kind of deep curiosity about human connection and, if you want to call it spirituality.
I was going to say, we all have a spiritual need.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily something we fulfill, and we do other things around it, but,
and for me, it's about people. It's about connecting to people. And it's like feeling that it's tuning in to this thing. We're all connected, right? We're connected in ways that aren't invisible and that are there's this guy, I can't remember his name, but so people talk about extrasensory perception, right? If you want to talk about psychic powers and whatnot and telepathy. But I think on some level, if we actually learn how to listen, there's a kind of primary perception. It's not extrasensory. It's actually a basic, super basic way that all living things, it's kind of like the Force. There is this kind of connection that I think a lot of things separate us from and distant, that we're cut off from for the most part because of all kinds of things in our world that cut us off from it. And I, in my life, have experienced deep, intimate connection with other human beings that it doesn't convince me that there's anything like an afterlife or a higher power, but it convinces me that there's something more going on between us than what we say and see.
What role do you think being raised in Montana in the we'll say the woods. I know it's civilized, but you know, being raised outside of you know, a super urban area, and then living in Vermont in your later days.
In Montana, there's a lot of running around in the woods, but it was a university town. My dad was a French lit professor, so it was this combo of you know, he had his library full of books. He was also a Jungian analyst, and you know, he had a pretty heavy library. And there was an oil painting of Baudelaire on the wall, a really creepy oil painting of Baudelaire.
So we just had those Keane paintings when I was a kid. So.
Oh, geez. Well, that sounds even, whoa. And then right out the front door was like the mountains and woods. My parents were very encouraging of my creative tendencies. So I read a lot of comic books and I did a lot of running around outside. And I feel like being out in the world, exploring and discovering things on my own gave me a sense of independence, and I love that feeling of like what's over the next ridge. You know, discovering things out in the world was a really great and fun part of my childhood. And then right after that, I moved to the suburbs of San Jose in California, where there was no wilderness; it was all shopping malls and developments, and I felt very lost in that environment. But luckily, I discovered Dungeons and Dragons while I was living there, and that was like a salvation for me.
You more of an Errol Otis guy or a Jeff D?
Ooh, David Trampier all the way.
Nice.
Those guys are fine. But Trampier was
we all had
genius.
our preferences with this stuff. But, so back to that question, though, the challenge within Berlin of not foreshadowing.
Yeah. It was a really interesting challenge. That's a really good thing to bring up. I tried as much as possible. One of my goals was to put myself in the shoes of people living at the time. So I tried not to think. I didn't read about anything that happened after 1933. I tried not to think about anything that happened after 1933. I just tried to think about the moment for the characters and what they would be feeling and doing, given everything that was around them. And there are a couple of times when there is a kind of some direct foreshadowing that comes into play, and my rationale for including those, I would have preferred to avoid any foreshadowing, because it's not like there's like a weird dramatic manipulation that happens there with the reader. It's like, hey, we all know what's about to happen. It's gonna be bad.
Well, I mean, any instance in which you put Hitler in a panel is going to be freighted with, you know, this knowledge. You know, there's one thing when it's someone you don't name who's, you know, a functionary in the party, but it carries all this.
But the weight of history is in him, and that's why I left out the swastika in the first 3/4 of the book, because I didn't want that's such a freighted symbol that it has so many powerful present day associations. It was powerful back then, but not to the degree it is now. And I wanted the reader to have that experience of being there on the street, and not just, if you just saw that symbol, you'd be like, okay, those guys are Nazis, got it. And you'd make that decision, that categorical decision to kind of exclude them from however you were evaluating. And I wanted them to be people. I wanted to show that they were humans like anybody else. Making
you
decisions.
Still think it's okay to punch out a Nazi, though, right?
There are times for punching Nazis. There definitely are.
I mean, I've said it before on the show. I went to the opening matinee of Inglourious Bastards just so I get a 6-hour head start watching my people scalp Nazis. That was, you know, I said it's opening at 7, but I'm going to the 1 o'clock showing because I want to get a jump on this.
That and Django Unchained, where
see?
Tarantino doing his
get the revenge,
giving people that satisfaction. Yeah, I think there's a time to punch Nazis, but I think in between the times when they are posing these existential threats to people, we have to figure out what to do about them, right? We have to figure out, I mean, are we going to exterminate the Nazis? That doesn't seem like a logical solution. I think we have to figure out how to handle these, you know, it's unfortunate that we have to think at all about entitled, white, mostly men who have these issues, and they must have an enormous amount of pain and frustration in their lives that they have to act the way that they do. But like that, those problems have to be dealt with somehow. But as soon as they stand up and start Sieg Heiling, I'm going to punch them.
Well, dealt with also implies a solution, which again,
I mean dealt with in like a non.
That's the question I had with Nora Krug as a German. You know, she was hard put to figure out whether it's better to ban something like Mein Kampf or let it be out there but put it in its context. If you ban it, then it becomes
more powerful.
Yeah, it's samizdat, and we have to, you know, surreptitiously read, you know. And it's tough. And she's coming from, German who's been living in the U.S. for 20 plus years.
Right. And so it's an even more powerful question for her with her, like.
Well, she also said she finally had to ask her assistant to get a copy of the book for her. And then I was reading it on the subway here in Brooklyn and then realized there was a Hasidic woman across the car from me. And I just put it down quietly.
I think you want a fake dust cover when you're reading.
Well, that's where I made the best joke I made on the show in a while, which was that you can get a Karlova Knausgaard, My Struggle fake cover.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. That's
and because it's Brooklyn, that would fly completely.
Totally would fly with.
Although that led to her telling us that in Germany, the Knausgaard books are not called My Struggle.
Sure.
They just use the subtitle of whatever the title is instead of Mein Kampf colon this.
That makes sense.
But again, it runs you down a slippery slope in terms of banning versus marketplace of ideas.
I mean, especially with the internet, banning something doesn't really have much function anymore. I mean, you can make a statement, right? Like when there was that protest against Tintin in the Congo in England, right? Bookstores carrying it, and I mean, if a certain population objects to the publication and sale of an overtly racist text, like that's a really
she brought up that
question.
example also and said, like, maybe what you do is have it behind the counter, have it in a context, so it explains, listen, this was how things were done then, this is not,
Or you have it in a library.
Yeah.
It's accessible, right?
But someone steals it and then, But the internet question does raise or the internet comment does raise a question for me. Are you glad you did not have Google Image when you were starting the research for Berlin?
Ooh, that's a tough one. No regrets. I like to have well, I can't really regret not having the internet because I couldn't change that.
Well, do you wish you'd had, that resource?
That's really interesting because I did have to do a lot of legwork to find the visuals that I needed. And definitely once Google Image Search became a thing, it was a lot easier to find. The hardest things to find, it was easy to find like the postcard image of the cathedral, but you couldn't find the picture of the working class living room, right? Like back when everything was just in books.
Yeah, well, it's an analog world.
But. Yeah, so I did have to, it was an interesting thing because I think I enjoyed the fact that I had to extrapolate. I could find the detail in a painting and then put that together with something in a photograph and kind of cobble together an environment. And I think that the imaginative part of that,
was the thrill of the chase thing also? Because we're comics people at the same era where hunting down that one issue of the X-Men was really important.
That's a really good point. Tracking stuff down and finding just the right thing. Or sometimes I would adapt a scene or even write a scene according to the visual stuff I found. Right, like characters in my story are often based on people that show up in paintings or photographs. Yeah. So a lot of the story came out of... And you do cite
Richard Powers at the end with three farmers on the way to a dance.
Right.
But again, do you think if you'd had Google Images, oh my God, what? Caitlin, what do you want? Come on in.
I'm so sorry. We're about to do the big award and remarks.
Okay.
I need to grab something.
Oh, all right. I was afraid you were dragging Jason out.
No.
Do you need to be? Okay, cool.
No, what's the big award and remarks?
I mean, you should see it.
We should see it, I know, but
It's going to be very special.
Wait.
But if you need to do...
Well, is it a big surprise? Is it a secret?
It is a secret.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, well, you should go. We'll get back and record after.
Cool?
Yeah, we'll as long as you're okay with coming back in here after.
Definitely.
So we went out from there to the lobby for the big reception, and the surprise that Caitlin was talking about was that John Porcellino was given the Transformative Comics Award for his work on King Cat all these years. John is a wonderful cartoonist. King Cat is a major achievement. He was floored by the whole experience. I wasn't close enough to see if he was crying, but I'm pretty sure he was. It was a really touching moment, just this giant lobby at Atrium full of comics people cheering on John P. I am glad I did not miss it, that Caitlin did drag us out there, even though Jason and I wound up not recording the second half that evening. Anyway, we got together, reconnected the next afternoon for a follow-up just after Jason finished doing a long signing of people buying copies of Berlin. This was at the library that hosts a lot of CXC's activities over the weekend, so the noise level and background's a little bit different.
So where I think we left off was whether you would have wanted Google Images to be around when you were starting out with Berlin, or whether you're afraid that would have led you down too many rabbit holes and kept you from, actually making stuff.
I think that it would have been really useful. It is really useful, and it was around for at least the second half of the whole book, and it was always my first stop when I was looking for a reference. And then, if I couldn't find something on image search, I would go try to find more printed source materials.
Yeah.
So yeah, it would have been a great boon to have that back in the late 90s.
But there was still that sensation of, and then I would have started researching something else, or just watching cat videos on YouTube or whatever.
Right. No, the danger of the internet in general would be looming and distracting, and that has proven true regardless. But I think the thing about getting distracted as far as the imagery goes is that a lot of that book actually came out of looking at pictures and looking at like there's a scene at the beginning that involves the first traffic light in Europe, and when I looked at the photograph that included that in it, I was looking at it because I needed a big wide shot of this particular part of the city, and then I looked and I saw that traffic light, and I thought that it was a really interesting element, and I researched it to figure out what it was because I didn't know from the photograph. So it led me into there's a page digression into the
guy inside.
So a lot of times the images, I would go down these kind of unexpected paths, but they would, and then those things would end up actually getting incorporated into the story. So the visual stuff was often kind of the open door into an unexpected part of the narrative for me.
Mm-hmm. To veer away from Berlin itself, what has teaching taught you about comics?
I think my approach to it, when I got this job offer to teach at the Center for Cartoon Studies, I'd always wanted to teach adults about comics or about how I think about comics. But the biggest question was what would be my approach? And I thought back to art school, and I thought about all the good, the teachers that for me, with whom I had the most positive experience and the way they taught things. And I realized that a lot of what was involved with it, there was often an element of surprise or something unexpected in the way that they presented material. And, so you'd come in and you'd be asked to do a series of things with an unknown outcome, and then the outcome would be revealed, and it would sort of show you, it would kind of throw everything that you had just done into a particular light. And I had a really positive response to that kind of teaching because it was exciting, like it was mentally exciting, and also when you went into class every day, you didn't know what was going to happen. So there was this feeling of like engagement and a kind of active participation. It was not somebody standing in a front of a room telling you stuff and then having you, take notes and then hopefully that'll mean something. It was a lot of in-class exercises and whatnot. So I tried to incorporate that in the classroom, and then what I discovered is that there's a real feedback loop there where when you get students engaged at that level, they start giving back to you. You get surprised as the teacher, the kind of work that they produce given a given set of constraints. And for me personally, as a cartoonist, that just ended up being a very energizing experience. Like I would, I prepare for class. I would often kind of stress out about it and feel anxious about it because there was always some kind of performance anxiety. Go in, teach, and then the next day would be a studio day. And my experience in the classroom the preceding day would have been so kind of exciting and would have gone in directions I didn't expect, that when I sat down to draw, I was like really looking forward to it because these students in the classroom had pointed out things about comics or had shown me in their own work things about comics that were kind of thrilling. So then I got to sort of take that energy and put it right into my own work. So it's been great for me professionally. Like it just has made it, it's kept me very excited about the medium itself. And then, you end up thinking about it when you're thinking about how do I teach. Like I have these intuitive ideas, or I have these ideas that I haven't really codified into any particular system. How do I do that? How do I take my approach to comics and communicate it to people that aren't me? And that's interesting because it gets you to think more consciously about a lot of stuff you might not otherwise.
Yeah, and that's what I'm sort of wondering. Are there things that you, and I think you've answered that, in terms of you didn't realize you knew something until you had to teach it?
Yeah, right. I didn't realize well, the big one I always teach my students is that when I sat back and I really studied Hergé, who had been a big influence on me, why do I like Hergé? Why is Hergé so popular? And I saw that his part of the reason is his stories are like little clockwork engines that always move forward, that the left to right movement of the characters and page turns, and it's very much, and they're almost always like a chase of some kind, and he takes advantage of left to right reading of English, and then or whatever Western language is read from left to right that he's translated into, and that thing that your eyes are already doing as they're tracking left to right, he took that motion and incorporated into the actual visual sequences. So like there's a kind of crazy momentum that he builds up in his books that make them kind of, it's hard not to read a Tintin story.
Yeah, it's a little like that line about Bushmiller, that it's tougher not to read Nancy than it is to read Nancy.
Yeah.
Your eye is just going to sweep right across and go.
So when I asked that question, why is it hard not to read Tintin, like I looked at the actual mechanical, the way that the comics function mechanically, and that's the kind of thing I discovered. So that's just one example of how once I put things under the microscope, what did I figure out? And it was often looking at my own influences and figuring out why did I have strong responses and how do I break that down and articulate it.
Who were influences on you early who you shook off?
Shook off? Ooh,
yeah, what were things that you're like, wow, I used to be like this, but...
Yeah, I remember there was a period, I was always...
John Byrne, X-Men! Just kidding.
I don't think I ever tried to draw like John Byrne. I'm trying to think, were there any mainstream guys that I tried to emulate? I don't think there were. When it came time to... I mean, I drew plenty of crude superhero comics when I was a young kid, but by high school, I think I was really inspired by Mobius.
The heavy metal set.
Heavy metal was huge for me. Yeah, like. All
but even there, I mean,
stuff.
are there things where you were trying to be Mobius in a certain way that I can't do that? I better go find my own.
Maybe very briefly. I do remember that once I got into art school and I was reading like Raw and some other stuff. There was a style I did like 3 stories in that was very much a conscious combination of like Pete Bag and Kaz, right? And there was this very fluid brush line and very rubbery characters and very, very cartoony. And my senior thesis at RISD actually was drawn in this style. And in fact, Pete Bag read that mini comic that I produced at the end of that, and he said, I guess, and then I produced work after that, and he insisted that was the best thing I'd ever done, was my senior thesis in art school. But I was like, wait, at a certain point I was like, I'm just like consciously aping these other artists, and I learned a lot from doing it, but it wasn't really me. It wasn't really, it was a formal experimentation.
And what was that a process like of finding yourself in terms of a visual style?
I think, and this is something I try to get my students to do too, is it's really an education when you copy other artists and really pay attention to how you do everything from draw lines on their characters to, fill the caption box with words, and through emulation and through mimicking and copying people that you admire or are drawn to. It's just a great way to get to know how they approach a thing. And then if you do that enough with a variety of different artists, for me anyway, eventually that kind of distilled, and I was able to get at who I am more as a cartoonist. And it turns out that I'm just somebody who has a relatively, in terms of how I draw pictures, a relatively objective way of trying to render things. I'm not a stylist. I don't try to... there's not a lot of like flourishes in my comics. I'm more of an engineer. I guess I figured out that as a cartoonist, it's more about the kind of arrangement and assembly than the actual drawing itself.
Well, it's something that came up when I recorded with David Lloyd. He mentioned that Dave Gibbons, the guy who drew The Watchmen, was trained as a surveyor. Yeah. And I just blurted out, "Oh my God, that makes so much sense!" And it's just realizing that way of seeing the world and composing everything spatially, so that it's an honest rendering of what's there instead of a expressionist or weird take on things.
That makes an enormous amount of sense to think about.
Now, the other question about Berlin taking much longer than you thought: were there follow-up projects you had planned for if Berlin finished when you were 40 versus what you want to do now that you finished it and you're around 50? Are there things you thought, oh, okay, I'll be finished at 40. This is what I want to do next. And did the extra 10 years change what some of those are?
I don't remember I feel like the things that I'm working on now that are the next things, those only really, they all come out of ideas I've had in the past 5 years. Mm-hmm. And I think in those early years, all I could think about was Berlin. I wasn't thinking about
what comes after.
And I would do stuff on the side. I would get offers to illustrate somebody else's script. Or I remember I did something for Books of Magic for Vertigo, and I did little stories here and there for other people. I wrote the Houdini book. And I didn't really... I think I had vague notions of wanting to tell other kinds of stories, of course, because I was trapped in Berlin in 1929 or whatever. But it wasn't until the actual end was in sight when I think my brain allowed that stuff to come up.
Fewer lines now.
Next time.
Yeah, and even now, I mean, we talked about how your style was consistent over 20 plus issues of Berlin, but looking back, the early ones, we'll just say, are fussier.
Yes,
that you do a lot more. There are more lines, and
yes.
It's something that came up in the panel I moderated today, that more lines seems authoritative.
Yeah, and it's also, it has this kind of, it's attractive. Like, I think the average viewer will be drawn to a more detailed drawing because on some level they're like, ooh, that took a while to draw.
Yeah, again, it conveys a sense of authority, but isn't necessary.
It's authority, and it's also, I think there's also just attention. Like, if you think an artist has spent that time, it's more likely to get you to spend some time, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that happens, I think, at an unconscious level, that kind of art can really attract a person because they understand a human being took the time necessary to draw that thing. So maybe it's of some value. It's harder to get super engaged with work that is really loose or quick or, depending on the artist, of course.
Yeah.
But it has that kind of built into it, that when you get into like detailed hashing and whatnot, that's definitely part of the equation.
Yeah, it was a question from the audience about this, and I brought up you as well as Jaime, who, if you look at the early 11 Rockets, a lot of fussiness, a lot of lines,
a lot of gray there.
When he got better was just black and white and letting the space speak for itself.
Yeah, and that's by the end of Berlin. I needed to have a certain amount of hatching because I didn't want it to look too different from the early stuff, but I definitely figured out there can be black areas, white areas, and then that gray area that you're shading can actually be pretty minimal. I was looking at Tezuka, who's an amazing, who in his art has this wonderful balance between those blacks and whites and grays, and being unafraid to leave both wide expanses of white and allowing that space to be filled by the reader's imagination. Comics is in a lot of ways a medium of suggestion where you can sort of give readers just enough and then they can take over from there, and that comes right down to the drawing itself. And that was part of my progression, evolution as an artist, is realizing that and then trying to incorporate that in.
And it strikes me that also when you're 18, 20, 22 issues in, you aren't getting new readers. New readers aren't looking at those pages and saying, there's not enough going on in here. The people who are in for the long haul at that point. So you, in a sense, you've already conveyed the density of information early on.
Right, I've already got them.
Yeah.
And I would do a thing, too, where I might, draw a scene where here's the establishing shot. Everybody, they're in a kitchen, and in that first panel, there might be, the countertop and all the stuff hanging from the ceiling and whatever. And then as the two people have a conversation, the background just might disappear, and it would just be a white background, which is commonly employed in comics. And it's great because when you do the work to sort of set up a situation and put it into the reader's head, then they'll hold that there in their head, and you can kind of drop a lot of that detail and let it kind of exist more in the mind.
Now, how much do you consciously concern yourself with mechanics and formalism, with storytelling, with making comics, versus the fluidity of story? And I know some of it is intended to convey that fluidity.
Yeah.
But do you ever run the risk of, I would say, almost being too clever
in terms of I not only run the risk, I think I fall into the trap. Great question. Yeah, I'm totally attracted to the formal elements of comics and how I like to experiment. And I think one of my things going into this is I want to see what comics can do. What do you got, comics? How can I show X, Y, or Z? Can comics handle the sense of smell? Can comics handle music? How do you tackle that? And I think there's a lot of places in Berlin where I am specifically trying to address, call it a problem or a puzzle of communication. And it feels indulgent sometimes. It definitely feels like I'm experimenting for the sake of... I don't know. I guess I wouldn't use the word clever because I'm not trying to show anybody that I'm being clever, but I'm trying to see if I can do something. So in that case, it's you kind of get away from, the underlying goal of the story to just tell the story about the characters. So it can be a little, I think, distracting sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say it's almost and he'll forgive me for saying this, a post-McCloud
Oh, for sure, yeah.
sort of thing, like without understanding comics, maybe a lot of, I would say cartoonists a little younger than you had that's what it means when I do this and this. And then it almost becomes I don't want to say a blueprint, but, you mentioned comics being constraint driven.
Yeah.
And when you learn there's a new set of parameters like that, you start kind of butting up against them, I suppose.
Yeah. I will say that understanding comics it reinforced a lot of stuff I already thought.
Yeah.
I was not influenced by that book. Scott himself had an amazing impact on my career because he was instrumental. Like my first book, he sort of pointed people at it, and he was at a high point in his career, and he had a lot of attention, and he took some of that attention and diverted it towards my book. So that was totally, I'll be eternally grateful for that. But when Understanding Comics came out, I was like, oh yeah, this is so great. It's like really breaking. This is stuff I'm already thinking about, and here was somebody who was articulating that, and so that was amazing. Cool. To see that happening. I resent the fact that he calls me a formalist. He divides everybody up.
That's what I was sort of wondering. That's the falling into that category.
My relationship is like, I feel like I'm an intuitive because that's where the story comes from, but I can totally understand why he would classify me otherwise, because if you're going to classify me, the very clear and obvious things that I'm doing are about kind of working with the form. Like how... Yeah.
Someone who's an outside observer as opposed to you having intuited where to go with this stuff,
Yeah.
The final product to somebody else is formal.
Yes, very, very clear.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I was wondering, that sense of formalism that can become too formal. That's how do you battle that? Or are you planning on exploiting that further in the new works that you're going to do?
I think the new work is going to be a lot more just about, in fact, not doing that. There won't be very much experimental stuff in terms of the form. It's really about using more of just, it's going to be a sort of conventional trappings, and then seeing, I guess the constraint there is like, what can you do within a completely conventional envelope? Then the creativity has to come into characters and dialogue and plot. Like you have to figure out how to make that interesting, and I think that's where I'm at now.
Cool. Yeah. German response to Berlin?
It's been surprising. It's been very positive. I've been very grateful for the reception that it's received. I think the thing that I did not expect was that I was very anxious, of course, because who's this kid from California? No longer a kid, but who's this person, this American who's going to tell us about her own history. When it got translated, I was very anxious about the reception, but the times I've been over there, everybody's been very supportive. And the thing that was interesting for me was people of my generation in Germany grew up with their parents not talking about their past, and in fact, it was largely it was like this huge void in their understanding of their own world, and a lot of people were just grateful that I had chosen it as a subject and said like, hey, this is interesting, this is important, this time and place is worth examining, obviously, but like for them it was like this kind of I heard from a lot of people who felt like it was very affirming for them, to have it kind of brought up.
Yeah, that was the vibe with the Nora Krug book, our guest last week, for whom what she says is basically the educational system in Germany for our generation, we didn't ask our parents and grandparents.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
We knew it was terrible. We knew everything was horrible, but we didn't ask on a personal family level about this stuff.
And I heard from a lot of people that even if you did ask, people would not talk about it.
Oh, no, there's another town where they did this. And it's always...
Yeah, it's always somewhere else where it happened. Never your family involved.
No, we were just working in the family store. That was or down in the mines or in the. So, do you wish you had CCS when you were growing up? You went to RISD and you sort of had to create a comics...
Yeah, it was a great experience to figure out for myself how to bring comics into a college level context when I was in art school, because there wasn't any narrative art was just not even acceptable. Mm-hmm. But when I set out to create a curriculum at CCS, one of the things I did was like, how can I cover all those years I spent educating myself about comics? How can I distill that into this 2-year curriculum and communicate, basically the equivalent of 20 years of experience to these students that are coming in, so that by the time they graduate, collapsed.
They got a head
20.
start.
They get a head start.
Yeah.
And I think that I would have absolutely loved if a place like that had existed back when I was going to art school, because it would have given me that head start.
The corollary is in 1999, I was handed the business plan for a magazine about pharmaceutical outsourcing, a topic I knew absolutely nothing about, and had to teach myself. And again, proto Google and all that. So there isn't a whole lot of information out there. Taught myself, launched the magazine, 15 years, quit to do my trade association. But the subsequent editors who moved into the space, I have given them all of this information, because it's usually people who don't have any background either. And I just live under the idea of, I wish to God someone was there to help me back in 1999.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do this for you, because I know what it's like not to know anything about a space, different than practicing an art, but still.
No, but very similar. And it's like you figured some stuff out. You spent a lot of time figuring some stuff out. So other people can benefit from that, right?
Well, my big one was I went into it assuming everybody knew what all the acronyms were except for me. And then I discovered none of you guys have any idea what these acronyms are. Okay, I thought it was just me this whole time, but nobody else can answer this question. So that's when I started putting together a glossary, running it in the magazine, and figuring, why don't we all find common terms and definitions for all this stuff? But not comics, but writing influences for you?
The big ones, I mean, there's lots, but the big ones would be Ursula Le Guin, because like her spare writing style, especially in The Wizard of Earthsea, was.
Did you go to see Charles Vess's adaptation?
I have not seen it yet. I'm very interested.
Okay, go tomorrow.
I think it'll be hard because I have my own personal visual world, but I want to see what he's done. Absolutely. William Faulkner. I read Faulkner out loud with a girlfriend in college, and that was a transformative experience because it unlocked, like the words themselves, the kind of sequence of words was like a magical spell that kind of like could unlock feelings without even the content coming into it. It was literally the specific words he chose and how they sounded in sequence. Reading that out loud was really amazing experience.
I was going to say that sounded almost like the worst first date next to my one where I took a girl to see Wild at Heart. But anyway, that's Nelly, that was something.
Yeah, it was As I Lay Dying, which is not the most cheerful book to read. Those were, when I think back on it, those were two really big influences. I've always loved Haruki Murakami. I shouldn't say always, because at a certain point I got tired of a very similar story being repeated over and over again. But Murakami was really big when I was in my 20s. Hard-Boiled Wonderland and The End of the World and The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle were big for me.
Mm-hmm. Coming out to CXC. How was it? How'd you like the Billy? What's been your experience
my
here?
first visit to CXC. The vibe is incredible. Just last night when John Porcellino got this
Transformative Artist Award.
Transformative Artist Award, and it was just like, I think there were a lot of tears in the room just to see John receive that award, which is so well-deserved. And, a lot of us, especially of my generation, have been reading King Cat for many, many, many years, and to see him recognized for his dedication and his heart is just like a really, really great thing. And then actually the what's the name of the award they just gave out on the floor?
The Emerging Talent.
So the Emerging Talent Award.
Who'd they give it to? Because I was
they gave it to Corinne Katz, who actually is the fellow at CCS this year. So that was like, and I got her in the classroom. She's actually taking my class just because, she doesn't have to. She's just in the class wanting to participate, and she's been an amazing presence in the classroom, and her work is beautiful. And so that was really, really cool to see that.
Yes, someone told me a story of her geeking out about, or being too nervous to speak to Chris Ware, and then Ware finding out she was there, and oh my God, I really enjoy your work, and her just turned into a puddle. So I'm glad she reconstituted well enough to attend class again. So did you see anything great at the Billy? Did you get to go through the library? Yeah.
So Caitlin McGurk, who runs the part of the library over there, is used to actually, another CCS connection, used to be the librarian at the Schultz Library at CCS, and so it was really great to see her. And she said, "Do you want to tour? The behind the scenes, like look in the drawers at all the original art?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure, if it's happening." But I remember before I came, I was like, I don't really need to see any of that old original art. Like, I don't.
Why would I want to see that?
Why would I want to see? I'm not like a fetishist when it comes to that stuff. Comics to me I've always been more about the printed, finished product. But oh my God, I was so glad that I was there at the right time to get that tour, because laying my eyes on like original Winsor McKay's, and we looked at some early Schultz. And there were some Bill Watterson originals in there. And it was just, like, I was really surprised by how moved I was just to see when you see something at its actual size that somebody drew it, especially if something's like 100 or 80 years old or whatever, and you just have so much more of a clear grasp of their human hand on the page. So it was like this, this kind of unexpected connection to the artist who had made those drawings. Just looking at how fine the lines on a Winsor McKay Little Nemo page are, or how fat and thick and just ridiculously lush something on like an original Prince Valiant page, So I was really unexpectedly moved by that stuff. Like, it was really inspiring to see.
That's a real final question. Paper or digital? Do you draw on paper?
Oh, it's still traditional for me.
Okay.
I've tinkered around with going digital, and the learning curve is big. And it's right now it's still so much easier and faster, which is ironic. And it took me 22 years to make this book, but for my next thing,
how much worse it could have been.
Yeah, it could have been so much worse. I'm still a traditional guy, and I use digital for cleanup and all that stuff. But I really still enjoy the tactile feeling of a pen or pencil on paper.
Jason, I will let you get back to it.
Thanks, Gil.
Thanks so much.
And that was Jason Lutes. His long-awaited new book is Berlin, a graphic novel about that city from 1928 to 1933, published by Drawn and Quarterly. It is an amazing piece of work, almost 600 pages in length, well-researched, well-drawn, great characterization. Deserves to see a wide audience now that it's complete. So go pick it up at your favorite bookstore or comic shop. Now, if you bought the first 2 trade paperbacks of Berlin, City of Stones and City of Smoke, Drawn and Quarterly published the conclusion as a standalone volume, City of Light. And that's a really generous move on their part, because they could have just put out this big hardcover compilation and kind of forced people to buy that if they wanted to see how it ended. But instead, they offered the 3rd volume also as paperback. I opted to go with the big, heavy hardcover, but I like big books, and I cannot lie. Now, after we wrap, I asked Jason, so, who you reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I'll get the 3rd quarter episode up soon. The most recent one features book recommendations from the 2nd quarter's Virtual Memories Show guests, including Stephen Heller, Dean Haspiel, Jaime Hernandez, J.J. Settlemeyer, Michael Kupperman, Ilana Meyer, Christopher Brown, Irvin Ungar, Alberto Manguel, Chris Reynolds, and Dave Calver. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which I'm only now realizing the last short story of which I have no interest in means I should put it off and write something else for that slot, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at CXC, Cartoon Crossroads, Columbus. All told, that trip cost me about $900 between airfare, hotel, and Lyft trips around town, as well as a couple of meals. I recorded this episode, and I moderated a panel with Creota Wilberg that'll become another episode, and I just got to talk with various pals, but there was no business write-off or revenue generator tied into this one. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Now, special thanks go out to Joe Caruso, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Paul Karasik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Noah Van Skyver, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with the artist David Small, author of the new graphic novel Home After Dark and the amazing memoir Stitches. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.